So the point of this, of what I wanted to do, was test for like biases for favorite dungeons. So one example that I use is, in my and a lot of other Holy Paladins' opinions, Glimmer H-Pal, the iteration of it we saw in Eternal Palace, where you just stacked Ineffable Truth, is the worst iteration of it. However, it felt like sometimes if you ask a bunch of like random people, especially like kind of like the lower you'd go in like any sort of rank, they're like, oh dude, Glimmer H-Pal's so good. Like, what do you mean it's so good? And there's the idea that people only like a class no matter how garbage it is because it just does a lot of HPS, because you're like doubling the other healers basically. I kind of think the same thing with dungeon or like M plus dungeons, where sometimes if I start reading forums or something, the feedback that people give of why they like one or why a dungeon is good is usually, generally speaking, really bad, and may not also match up with what like higher end players are going to think. We certainly saw a kind of good example of this with everyone voting for like Grimrail Depot for when they said, oh, what dungeons would you want to bring back, which we saw obviously at the end of the Shadowlands expansion, right? They brought back Grimrail, which sucks, and Iron Docks, which is like, okay, I don't know how I feel about Iron Docks, but Grimrail, that is like the worst dungeon. You never want to bring that back. It sucks. You just can't see anything. It's awful. So that being said, it's just kind of like when you look at what people say is like, oh no, this thing's really good. This thing's really good. Most of the time I'm like, what are they talking about? It's just that you think you do, but you don't. I love looking at things like that. So going back to the dungeons, the reason I did this is because people vote for their favorite dungeons. But what I'm saying is I think there's things that make it super predictable as to why you might vote a certain way. Initially, this started out as me looking at, I thought, what if the dungeons were given kind of like a difficulty ranking? And then we saw people are way more likely to say, oh, I like this one because it's easier. Just to give like an example, let's just say Theater of Pain was like the highest timeable key. That's arguably one of the harder, or not even arguably, it just is one of the harder keys in Shadowlands. And one thing that you'll notice later on when we see the breakdowns is people definitely voted for it a lot less. I really think if you just suddenly made that key super timeable, people would like it way more. So originally I was going to test this by difficulty ranking, but which I'll talk about later. I kind of ran into some issues with that because you kind of have to make up a system to assign these rankings to begin with. And the sample size that we took from, we noticed people not only overrepresented how good they were at the game from the survey, but this data was collected by Raider.io through like their social media. And if you think about it, a smaller portion of WoW players even have social media to begin with, and the kind of people that would be following Raider.io, which follows around following like M plus rankings, or that's where it originally started, you're going to get a collection of players that are already like pretty skilled. So the ideally you'd survey the whole range of players, but it's like semi-limited because of that. That being said, we still adjust for that, which we'll look into later. So yeah, I already just got the intro. So what we did here, the questions that were asked on it, this is a survey that was put out by Raider.io, and this is exactly what it looked like. So it was the highest levels completed. So this is where I would have been able to divide it by skill level, right? So you'd ask them like, what's the highest level keys you've been able to complete in any of the expansions? I could have done it per expansion, but one thing I started noticing when I asked around a few people, it was hard for people to recall, especially in Legion, like, oh, what's the highest you completed? Because most people can remember the highest things they completed, but it's like, for what patch? We adjusted this for patch and wanted to compare only either the second or the third patch in the expansion to keep it the same, because as time goes on, the numbers get a little more inflated. So it was important to kind of like identify specific time periods in each expansion. So that's why I thought, you know what, we best measure like the current skill level of the player through all of them, because it will just kind of be easier, and too many people didn't accurately record what their skill level was per expansion. So that's why it was simplified to just total, like, right, what's the best you've ever done. And then we just asked basically per expansion, what was your favorite Mythic Plus dungeon? And obviously all of them are listed. And we gave the option for didn't play, no opinion, which I'll say why that was important, which you can already probably assume. And then anytime you run a survey, in my opinion, you should always add any additional thoughts or what do you think of blah, 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 an open-ended question. You get way more out of this than you realize. And that's like something I learned really early, especially in my university. So I kind of hit on this here. Due to concerns about whether people could accurately recall the specific key level completions from years ago, the first question of the survey regarding the response's highest completed key was not divided by expansion. So I said that there. And then the framing of all three questions containing what was your favorite expansion's Mythic Plus dungeon was intended to capture the respondent's favorite dungeon. We considered using the word best instead of the word favorite. However, we ultimately ruled out the term best as the respondents might associate best with what kind of loot the dungeon dropped or whether the key was the easiest to complete towards achieving higher IO score. Like, for example, the first thing I think of is in either BFA or the current expansion, since they brought it back in Shadowlands, Junkyard. Not only is that like a pretty popular crowd favorite, but it also drops some of the best loot. It has like those rings that especially DPS really, really wanted, right? So I was concerned about saying like, I was concerned about using the word best because some people might think like, oh yeah, because it's got the best loot, or oh, because it's like, you know, this and that. So that's what we just kind of thought favorite might fix that a little bit. I spent a lot of time like choosing the wording on this one, so ultimately landed on the word favorite. So when we see the breakdowns for what people voted for, this is what we see. So for Legion, this is really important to put in didn't play, no opinion, because almost 40% of the people that voted said that they didn't play. You don't want them voting because they're like forced to vote. And instead of leaving it like an optional choice in the survey, it's better to just leave something to click because sometimes people think they have to answer. So it's always important to include that. But as you can see here, the most popular was Maw of Souls. Let's see, Court of Stars, surprisingly, was only a little more popular than Nelslayer. And then Eye of Ashara, and then it just kind of goes in descending order. Just goes into... Oh, that's interesting. This graph is a little weird. But yeah, Halls of Valor, Archway, Darkheart Thicket. Oh, Archway's down there. That's weird. The hover is a little... Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm an idiot. It's just the labels are all over here. Yeah, Eye of Ashara, Halls of Valor, Darkheart, Archway, Karazhan, Cathedral, and Upper Karazhan. This one surprised me, by the way, because I voted for, like, Cathedral. That was my favorite Legion dungeon, but it's the second least popular one, apparently, so... Damn. Cohen is yeah, I actually voted Cathedral. And this is what I mean, where I think... Personally, I think I can separate from, like, the easiest dungeon, because I know I get the most excited when I would see, like, a Freehold, or a Court of Stars, or... a miss in my bags. Like if a key rerolled to that, I'd be like, oh yeah, hell yeah, we got a miss, right? But if you think about it, like what is my favorite dungeon, if you kind of sit and think about it, it's actually Cathedral for me. But this is the point of this, right? To kind of test what people say. So for BFA, we only had 13 say they didn't play, no opinion. But yeah, Freehold, I think Freehold got actually the largest percentage of voters across like all of these. But yeah, Freehold almost at 40%, Waycrest at 14%, Atal Dazar at 11%, Junkyard at 9.4%, and then it just went to Underrot, Temple, Mechagon, Shrine, Siege, Toldagor. One thing to note here is I did intentionally want to include Mechagon and whatever. People had less time to run these. It's possible that the people voting they happen to not play during this patch, so it might receive a lower percentage of voters, but, you know, again, nothing's going to be perfect, right? You can make corrections for it. People equate the feeling of, yeah, I have this with being their favorite. Exactly. So that's kind of like what we're looking at here. So then for Shadowlands, most popular, Halls of Atonement 25, into Tazavish Gambit, where Tazavish and Streets are going to run into the same problem of it was only there for the one. This was only here for one patch for the specific patch that we were looking at. Or when I say we, I mean I, by the way. This is just me. I keep saying we because I hate saying I. But yeah, surprisingly, that was more popular than Miss. And then I went to Necrotic Wake, Sanguine Death, Streets, Theater, Other Side, Plaguefall, Spires, and then Didn't Play, No Opinion was at 0.6%. But yeah, you can see this here. Now, here's the thing that I pointed out earlier that I was worried about happening, which was what's the highest level that you completed, or highest level key that you completed across all the expansions? 55% said 20 to 24, and it's very easy to assume that this number is not true if you consider even every active max level player currently. There is no way it would be 55%. And then if you include the 25 and up, that equals like what? A little over 80% are recording that they can do 20 and above strictly, right? But yeah, 15.6% said 15 to 19. Most honest people on the planet right here in this bracket. And then the 2 to 14, 1.3%. You would expect these to be flipped. Like 2 to 14 would genuinely be like 55%. 15 to 19 would be in this group. 20 plus would be this, but even that would be smaller. And then 25 plus would be in the 1.3% category. Like these, if anything, should be roughly flipped. But you know, you get the point. I've acknowledged these issues, but it doesn't change the fact that we can still isolate these for the future stuff that we went through. So, I elaborate on that here. 55% of people who would engage with forum or 2-4. This kind of follows also something. Yeah, that's what I said earlier, right? This came from Writer.io, so not only do people just lie in surveys, even if they're completely anonymous, but where this sample size came from, or where the sample came from, are in general going to be higher level players or higher skilled players, whatever. So, I lied. Thank you. Getting to the actual like equation stuff, right? So, like I said, originally I had wanted to test dungeon difficulty versus them saying it's their favorite. I ran into some issues with that because it's kind of hard to assign a difficulty rating. Like, do we do it based off of the number of runs that were completed above a 25 plus level, or what? Now, let me open up my Excel sheet because I tried testing this a few different ways. The first way I tried doing it was exactly what I said, number of runs. So I'll use Shadowlands since it's current for the example. So the number of runs that were completed for 25 and above for the whatever it was, second or third patch, the highest one was Necrotic Wake at over 17,000, and these are accurate numbers because all of this. So that the dungeon data, by the way, came from Raider.io's API, I think it is. I'm not very good at like coding terms. That being said, I won't show any of it because I signed an NDA. I am not supposed to share like the data I received, but just to be safe, I'm not even going to share the mathematics on my other screen. But just trust me that that's true, because they published it on their site. But the most completed with 25 and above was 17,000 runs were timed. These are timed runs. The next highest was Plaguefall at just over 15,000. The next was Tazavesh at just over 15,000, but a little less. And then Halls of Atonement, and then Streets, then Mists, so on and so forth. So when you do it by number of runs, you'll see the problem where Necrotic Wake was voted as one of the mid ones, yet it has the most runs completed because if you did the weapons right, it was busted. Mists was like pretty mid. And one thing that you'll see accurate, or kind of accurate, is Sanguine Depths. From memory, wasn't a very popular dungeon, but it had the least timed runs at a 25 and above. And just above it's like the other side, and just above it is Spires of Ascension, right? So, Mist was pretty mid. Yeah, Source, trust me, bro. Yeah, it is. I can't share this. But yeah, they did pull it from their API, which is very cool. That being said, I was having trouble because there's some dungeons like that. I used another example in Freehold, where Freehold actually did not have the highest. You would think it would, but for 20s and above for the certain patch we used, because 25s were not completed in this patch, so we used 20s and above. The most completed one was actually Underrot. And then you think that's weird. Freehold is easier. It's like Freehold. What was interesting was Underrot overall was easier, but Freehold, if you had the perfect week, was easier. I think it had to be like fortified because the first boss, I'm forgetting her name or their name, the trio, they were like impossible on Tyran, and if you got like sanguine because they don't move, you'd have to kind of like pull around that and stuff like that. There's a few other things, like the shark boss is kind of BS. The bosses just in general take a long time, so there's interesting things like that can kind of skew depending on like affixes. So sanguine, I don't know why I said it like that. But then as I was going through this, first I thought like maybe I'll take the top 60 players from each expansion, average out their highest timed key per keystone, like type of keystone it was, and then put that in like a ranked order. That ended up turning out being exactly the same ranking as the number of runs completed above a certain level, so it didn't really matter which way you did it. They all ended up being listed in the same order. So then the problem is, do you either assign like a ratio for numbers completed or the level, or do you do it in like a ranked order? Basically, it didn't really matter. No matter what I did, I kept getting a statistically insignificant result, which basically means by statistical standards, we couldn't confidently say that any result I got was due to predictable factors. Like there's a high enough chance that these results were generated by chance, so I can't sit here and make this claim confidently that this is the case. So one thing I did start to notice was it looks awfully a lot like the shorter the timer, the more closely related they are, right? So that's when I thought, what if we redo this, but you compare favorite to timer? So then the whole thing changed to this, because that's when I started seeing like, okay, there's definitely a relationship here. So that is what the dependent variable is, which is the reported favorite dungeon, and then their independent variable, which is the dungeon timer. So we get to the methodology. To analyze the effects of independent variables in respondent's favorite key, a single linear regression was used. The basic empirical strategy is to compare all the received responses and test if it has any effect on the dependent variable. I know what a regression is. I a lot of times can't put that in super technical terms, but this will generally give you like a good idea. I'm the kind of math person where I'm very bad at proofs, but if you give me like a practical question, I'll be able to do it and understand what I'm doing. So I'm one of those people. So don't ask me to get like too specifically into what exactly is an error term. I'm like, well, I could tell you like the definition, what's supposed to do, but I couldn't tell you more than that. So, this is the regression used, which is the y. Y equals delta plus beta plus error term. Oh, I didn't list what y was, but yeah, y is basically the survey responses, or I'm sorry, delta. Oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm like fucking up. Yeah, delta survey responses, and then the timer, and then the error term, which you don't actually technically have to show, but whatever. And then if you remember the ranking, actually no, I'll get to this later, but I showed the rankings and then listed it as 1 to 10, with 10 being the most popular, even though it technically shows reverse on the charts, but you'll see what I'm talking about in a second. So when we regressed, what is your favorite key on the timer? This is what we got. This chart shows a trend. Obviously it's not perfect, but for Legion, this is basically what you saw. Maw Souls is the most popular, and the Vault of the Wardens was the least popular. But you can kind of see basically that the shorter the key was, the more popular it was. And then the longer it was, the less popular it was. Now, the biggest outlier here is Halls of Valor. From memory, I was like, I did not remember these keys being this long, but I think these were the longest keys that they actually made, and they're both at 45 minutes. Surprisingly, they were kind of in the middle for votes, but, you know, whatever. It's how it is. So I said here, yes. So when you did this, the results gave us a p-value of 0.1205, meaning that there's a 12.5% chance that these outcomes are by chance. The minimum significance standards that they need to meet is 90%, which means it's just 2.05 over. Usually people test for, like, if anyone took any like stats in high school or whatever, you'll remember the standard that people usually use is 95%, but the minimum standard you can use is 90%. But so I'm just basically stating here that no matter how you want to frame it, it doesn't meet minimum standards. It's basically saying like there's roughly an 88% chance that this is like a proper causal relationship, not by chance. But we'll get to that further. For BFA, it was even further. The p-value ended up being 30.35, which means there's like a 70% chance that there's a possible relationship there, basically, which is definitely way too far. But Shadowlands, oh, sorry, I forgot to show the chart. This is what the chart looked like for BFA. It looks a little more all over the place. But yeah, this is what it visually looked like. Obviously, you see Freehold and Wakecrest over here, Atal Dazar over here. It just didn't quite give us a good result. So then when you get to Shadowlands, we saw a pretty strong trend here. When we had to Shadowlands, it said when we arrest dungeon timers on survey rank, we receive a p-value of 0.0097%, indicating that there's a very strong relationship between key preference and lower key timer. So basically this is saying there is over 99% chance that there is a relationship here. There's a less than 1% chance that we got these results by chance. For every, basically if you increase any timer on a dungeon by 1 minute, the survey rank will decrease by 0.5. So people are, so you get the point. Basically 2 minutes, it would knock it down a rank by about 1, if you like rounded everything. So then, to investigate further, combined all the dungeons into one, and this is what this looks like. This is the total thing. And again, we see the favorites here. Freehold, Maw of Souls, Halls of Atonement, blah, blah, blah. You see all of the expansions combined here. Tol Dagor and Siege at the very, very bottom. Oh, that's crazy, actually. I didn't really think about this. 3 of the bottom dungeons are from BFA. Shrine of the Storm, Siege, and Tol Dagor. So, Shrine can eat shit. So here's the thing. I discussed this here. Because the surveys for dungeon popularity were in a ranking order of 1 to 10, 1 to 10, and 1 through 11, because in Legion, in Legion there's like 11. Again, we're leaving out like the last patch, which means See the Triumphire wasn't included because this was not included in the patch, in case anyone's wondering where's Seat. That wasn't included because of the patch that was chosen. We had to determine a way to accurately assign a ranking for dungeons across these expansions with the appropriate weighting. So with this being, the reason we had to do this was because, let's see, votes. Yes. For Freehold, out of all the expansions, Freehold got by far the most votes at 374. Then if you look at the most popular dungeon for Shadowlands, the most popular was Halls of Atonement at 268. And then the most popular for Legion was, let's see, where was it? Maw of Souls at 237. So Freehold annihilated it. Now, the problem is if you normalize everything, that doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that people like Freehold 4 times more than the average dungeon. At first, I thought like maybe we could kind of reduce this and put it into fractions or ratios, but then it's like, but then the problem with that is it would weigh Freehold 4 times more popular than the other dungeons, which I'm like, that's not really accurate. So then this reason is why originally for these graphs, we thought because of the disproportionate amount of votes to normalize for it, they got to rank 1 through 10 based on the votes. Because it's really hard to kind of like control for that. So the problem here is the same amount of people didn't vote for Legion dungeons as they voted for Shadowlands dungeons, because if you remember, almost 40% of people opted to not vote for Legion dungeons because they did not play that expansion, which is exactly what I wanted to do. So what I did is I assigned a ratio of votes. Let me find the number here. Just trying to find. So basically what we did is per expansion, you took a ratio of the votes against its own expansion, and it was like assigned a specific number. So it's like this percentage of people voted for this dungeon. So let's just say, what was it? 40% of people voted for Freehold for that expansion. That goes at number 1. And then if you think about it, what was the next popular one? It was like, God, I forgot already what it was. Like, let's just say for Shadowlands, it was like Mist, right? Mist got 25% of that expansion's votes. So that was the second most popular. This ranking was based off of the percentage of votes it got per expansion. So when you do it, it just goes Freehold, Maw of Souls, Halls of Atonement, Waycrest Manor. And it's like when you kind of look at these numbers, they make sense. That way it normalizes for the people that opted out of voting for the previous expansions. It like controls for it. So that then they, when you look at the ratios, order them, then they were assigned the same number. Oh, my character's about to log out, sorry. Then they were assigned a number 1 through 31, just like the previous ones were, like a 1 through 10. So just to explain exactly how we got here. So when you look at all of these, I kind of explained it here, but I didn't elaborate on it. And I'm like, unless someone kind of does stats, I was unsure how like understandable this was. But basically resulted in a p-value of 0.0035, which is even stronger than Shadowlands by itself. This generally happens when you increase the sample size because it makes things more accurate. But when you combine all of the expansions, it's basically saying that there is, once again, over 99% chance that there is a relationship here, and it is not by chance. So this would basically mean that for every 1 minute increase in the timer, the survey rank will decrease by 9.2. So instead of the Shadowlands one where it was about half, it's basically saying now for every minute increase, the rank will decrease by almost 1 second. And the R² result is 27.43, which means the timer explains 27.43% of the reason why a respondent will select any of the dungeon as their favorite. I want to make sure I hit on this too, because I don't want someone to see this and be like, oh, so no matter what, the timer will indicate how much someone likes a dungeon. No. What the R² means is it's residual squared, which is the square of a residual, which is basically squaring like the distance that each point has from the trend line. So basically, if you look at this, right, Halls of Valor and Archway would have a large residual, right? So it's just basically those squared. This means that if you survey everyone on what is your favorite dungeon, 30% of the reason they select their favorite dungeon will be due to the timer, the length of the dungeon. So here I elaborated a little bit more on the difficulty. I want to see if there's a relationship between dungeon difficulty, and it's a hard time to determine what exactly a difficult dungeon entails. So we tested out a few variables, and I think I elaborated on this earlier, but I can kind of go through it here in order. We use the following classifications where it's like Legion, anything 20 and above, Battle for Azeroth, 20 and above, and for Shadowlands, we use 25 and above because on the patch, these numbers were more close to each other. It's just like in relation to each other, this is accurate. So the patches combined were 8.2, 9.2. And then if you're like, why are you using 7.2.5 for Legion? That's because Mythic Plus seasons had not yet been established. This is when Raider.io was kind of assigning seasons themselves. And after talking with like their data analysts and stuff, the most accurate patch that is related to these two is 7.2.5. So that's why that one was used instead. So the first attempt, like I said, we pulled the top 60 profiles of each of the patches and averaged out the player's highest time key and assigned that number to the related dungeon difficulty level. And then regressed it, which just kind of yielded insignificant results. There's also one thing I wanted to add here is that players using with the top 60 profiles, they often use strategies that are not really reasonable. So one of the examples I use is Plaguefall, the Plague Boar strat. For anyone that watched the MDI or anyone that didn't, if you remember, the Echo team had used some crazy strat where I didn't even see it myself. I was just told about it. I think they were using like Plague Boars through the whole thing. That's like really, really hard to execute. And there might have been some like snapping and weird shit involved. Like for lack of a better word, like hard exploiting. Even the average high team, that is a really hard strategy to execute. So it's like that might kind of skew the results for how hard a dungeon is actually kind of supposed to be, right? Yeah, misdirect bug plus snapping, exactly. Toldagor kind of had the same problem where there were some really unique and interesting like cannon pulls that people had done. On top of that, just from memory, it's been a long time. I know on the last boss, there were ways you could kind of like, I don't want to say exploit, but people could figure out exactly how the boss interaction worked with like the shotgun, and there were places or things you could do to stand to like avoid it completely, or there was some weird gimmicky stuff you had to do with the last boss that again is not very easily executable. Yeah, you could pull just exactly Toll the Gore is like it was so weird. So I wanted to mention this, where it's like a possible problem with pulling from the top profiles is they might skew the results because these players use these like crazy strategies. So each way, as I mentioned earlier, that I tried to assign difficulty, like, okay, what if we do it based off of number of runs completed above a certain level? Or what if we pull the top 60 from each player profile? Or what if we just arbitrarily assign a difficulty rating based off of, let's be real, we know which one's the hardest one. No matter which way I did it, it didn't give me significant results. So I couldn't, I can't make any claim that that's due to anything. So I think I kind of did a lot of discussion as I was going through anyway, but let me see. The overall, the findings of calculation reveals that the model used to predict these survey ratings from players is significant. As stated earlier, by expansion, the results yield differing results, and the difficulty metric proved to be insignificant. Let's see. So yeah, I elaborated this too. The first section, or the first topic to address the framing of the survey. Framing is one of the most important factors in trying to collect data from respondents. There's always a possibility of receiving results that aren't representative of what a population may truly feel due to factors like survey takers, misunderstandings of questions, regional differences of word meanings, etc. So I'm just including on that as well. This is always a factor to include. You'd be surprised how clear a sentence can be, but people will still interpret it a different way. So it's kind of like a mandatory disclaimer that you have to put anytime you do something survey-based. So there's another thing here that I mentioned, that there's consideration regarding us asking the highest level of keys completed by respondents per expansion, because even myself, just out of curiosity, I asked some other like really high key pushers, like MDI people. I said, what is the highest level keys that you completed in this patch? And when they said off the top of their head, they're like, oh yeah, I think I did it this, blah, blah, blah. A lot of times people were thinking of like the later patches and they were misciting it. Because like I said, when you look back at the, I think it was the BFA dungeons for the patch I looked at, nothing above 25 was completed. Yet a lot of people were saying, oh, I was doing 25s in that patch. So people are like misremembering. And that's where that fear came from, including myself. I even overestimated what level key I was doing during the 7.2.5 Legion patch. Because I mean, it was 6 years ago, right? And then I hit on this here saying it's very clear that the 25 plus, or the 20 plus and the 25 plus section is overrepresented. The good thing is you can correct for that by saying, well, we can still just look at our smaller section of people listing 15 to 29, right? Although we have a smaller pool of them, it was still enough to get reasonable results from it. So it didn't really matter too much that it was overrepresented. But one thing to note here is it did not matter. It did not matter what level of keys the respondents were completing. The order listing of what they listed as their favorite key remained the same across all skill level groups. It actually didn't change at all across each expansion. The ratios might have a little bit, but not like a lot. Do you think the percentage is because people don't have groups to play M+ compared to people who do? Percentage of what? Let's see. So yeah, although this was like skewed in one way, it didn't really matter because across all groups they ended up being the same. Well, no, I don't think that would be skewed, because for each expansion there's still going to be roughly the same percentage of players that are unable to get consistent groups. That doesn't really change per expansion too much. So yeah, this is what I was saying, where again I hit on the possibility that these groups were overrepresented because, one, people don't remember correctly, including myself, and also, again, think about the average person that follows the Raider IO account on Twitter and opts in to fill in the survey. They're on average going to be higher skilled players, or like higher level players. Let's see. Yeah, the second explanation. So first off, when I say haha people lie in surveys, this is like definitely true. It does not matter what you are testing. I'll give like a ridiculous example and say, if people are surveyed on any sort of like genital size that they have, or what do you think your IQ is, or anything, even if it's completely anonymous, even if they know the actual answer to this question, people always overstate what they are, even when it's completely anonymous. So that's the other problem with surveys. No matter what you do, you're pretty much always going to get that. So next I would like to explain possible reasons why all the combined data shows there is a strong relationship, but when you divide it by expansion, there is not a significant result. Well, actually, there was for Shadowlands. There almost was for Legion. Wasn't at all for BFA. So we'll elaborate here why the collective data shows that there is a relationship, which is the one you want to rely on more anyway. So for Legion, if you recall, the regression gave us a p-value of 0.1205, meaning that there's basically almost an 88% chance that these results are due not to by chance, but because there is legitimately a relationship there. One of the big indicators is that Vault of the Warden scored the lowest in the popularity scale, but was tied for third as the shortest dungeon. I don't remember what other dungeon it was, but Vault is actually a very short dungeon. Additionally, Halls of Valor and the Archway have the longest timers across all expansions at 45 minutes. However, among Legion dungeons, they scored 5th and 7th for popularity, which is kind of obviously around the mid-range. Despite these outstanding relationships, the Legion breakdown provided a likely yet insignificant result. In other words, I just said what I said earlier. I don't really have an explanation for this. I couldn't really say why Vault was so unpopular. There's also another thing that I consider where it's like, what if you did like, I forget what the kind of ranking is called, but it's like, if this dungeon is ruled out, then what's your favorite? If this is ruled out, then what's your favorite? Because it's possible like that the most popular one in Legion is Maw, right? But what if everyone's second favorite dungeon who voted for Maw, what if all of their second favorite dungeon was actually Vault of the Wardens? Vault could actually be more popular than we realize, but when you only have one option to choose one, it's sometimes that can just skew it a little bit. So that's one possible explanation. Don't really know, but just kind of stating the outliers in Legion. Battle for Azeroth. We have a lot of explanations here. This one I think we can all kind of assume. So this is, recall the regression gave us a p-value of 0.3035. Total War and Siege of Bralis both scored last and second place in place of popularity. However, they are both mid-length dungeons with a timer of 36 minutes each. Outside of these, and keep in mind, Siege has different timers depending on your faction. I think Alliance had one more minute. I don't actually remember, but they were not even timers, which also people were not very happy about. But yeah, outside of these dungeons, we see ones like Atal Dazar and Underart ranking the highest in popularity whilst having the shortest timer. King's Rush and Shine of the Storm were the longest BFA dungeons with timers of 42 minutes, ranking 6th and 8th respectively. Siege of Borealis and Tol Dagor have the highest residual, meaning they were furthest from the trend line. So I'll just go up and re-show you the graph just for a visual to show you exactly what I'm talking about here, right? Wait, what was I talking about? What did I say? Siege and Holigor. Wait, no, I didn't. Oh, wait, I used the wrong terminology there. They don't have the highest residual. That's not what I meant to say. I messed up there. I'll have to ask if they can edit that. So the problem is they were voted the least popular whilst having like a mid-level or like middle length of like key timer, right? So or no, King's, sorry, I'm like stuttering really hard. So you'd expect that they would be like a mid-voted dungeon, right? Because of the timer, right? That's kind of what I'm testing for. The problem is, as we talked about, Ashvane spotters, or why they were so unpopular, right? First off, I said players had similar complaints against Siege of Borealis. I'll go back up to this. Let's see, Tol Dagor. No, sorry. I'll start with Tol Dagor. I explained Tol Dagor first. A reason for this may be that the dungeon housed commonly known issues for bugs and gimmicks. Tol Dagor was a multi-level prison, in all senses of the word, where we ascended vertically with enemies on each floor. And I'm just saying this for anybody that might not have played this expansion. One of the biggest issues with Tol Dagor was that you would sometimes inadvertently pull mobs through the floor above or below, which often assured a wipe. It interacted dangerously with a few Mythic Plus affixes because of the close quarters and enemy types. So it's like sometimes I remember if you would pull through the floor, and if it was like bolstering weak or if it was like sanguine weak, like that made it so much harder. I know even myself running that key, that happened like a handful of times. This won't be perfect, but from memory, it feels like 1 in 5 of my Toll the Gore runs were like bugged, or a bug would happen that would assure like a wipe. Not necessarily a deplete, but a wipe usually nearly ensures a deplete. So like you get the point. That dungeon was really bad. And yeah, on top of that, there were some affixes that were just really unfriendly with it. I made a comparison to Grimrail Depot since they brought it back. Sanguine is awful for Grimrail because of the close quarters. Like one sanguine at any part of like the train hallway will generally take up the whole space if it's not clipping into the side, right? Like if it's directly in the center, that nearly blocks like the entire hallway. Like it's just, and Toll the Gore kind of had a similar layout to that. Not quite as restrictive, but you get the point. The dungeon featured cannons that were incredibly powerful, but with the limited ammunition, which was a change that they made later. If players died or missed cannon shots, they would lose a significant amount of time with no second chances. Basically, for anyone that did not play this expansion, you'd kind of try to group up the adds in a very controlled way. When they were there, you'd shoot the cannon at them. If you messed up and didn't kill them all, especially if it was bolstering, you would have a massive add where you either just kind of had to wipe, or hopefully if you were Alliance, just shadow meld it out of combat. But a lot of people also use shadow meld to get to the cannons to the first place as a skip. So it was really like touchy. And there's like this unforgiving portion of the dungeon was situated near the end, meaning that players often invested a great deal of time by that point, only to have the dungeon depleted unsatisfyingly. So I said another thing for Caesar Borealis, right? For example, Ashbane spotters were used to kill much of the trash with friendly fire in the latter part of the dungeon, especially on bolstering weeks. So how this would work is there'd be an Ashbane spotter, and it would drop something called sighted artillery, which is like it felt like, I want to say like a 10-yard AoE on the ground. You would randomly target some of the players, so what you would do is stand on the mobs, hope it targeted you, and then they would like one-shot them because you would just keep bolstering the Ashbane spotter. So you would drag this thing around and have them basically kill the instance for you. The problem is, I think there was some mobs that it didn't affect, so you had to make sure you like threaded the needle around some of them. And on top of that, again, if you missed some mobs, you would bolster other ones, and then they would take a lot longer to kill by the spotter, and it would be a wipe. And then if you wiped, the bolster stacks would reset on the spotter. It's over. It was really a really touchy thing, and I remember every time I got siege, I hated it for this reason. It was so gimmicky. So additionally, the final boss had some RNG with the spawn location for the tentacles. How this worked was on the final boss, some tentacles had like, I think it was 3 different spawn locations. You would ideally want them to spawn next to each other so you could cleave them, but you could get really unlucky where one spawns really far, and then it also spawns away from the NPC that you're supposed to save, and it makes it like a lot harder. Yeah, they get this thing off me, that mob. So it's like if you had bad tentacle spawn locations, especially if you were on Tyran week, it was like that could just kind of wipe you. There was like definite tentacle RNG there. Also, sometimes if you had crossed the bridge, the boss who is not supposed to melee you would melee you and one-shot you. And the reason it would one-shot you is because we're not actually fighting the boss. There's just 3 separate platforms where you wait to get in a cannon after you kill all the tentacles, and you shoot the boss, it's stunned, you move along. But sometimes it'll just melee you anyway. Let's see. Oh yeah, one additional thing to note that for the Alliance faction, there was almost 1 minute of additional NPC roleplay. I think I said Alliance had it shorter. I don't remember. But yeah, Alliance had 1 minute of additional NPC roleplay, causing an imbalance in the dungeon across both factions. Now, you could argue, well, they have Shadow Meld. Well, I don't know. Shadow Meld was useful in the dungeon, sure, but not as useful as just not, like, having the minute. So, what I'm proposing here is, they had mid-length timers, but these are both voted as the least popular. The conclusion that I am coming to here is, if they did not have gimmicks, if Toldagor wasn't super buggy and there was actual camera freedom and not some really aids, things like that, or there wasn't like Ashvane spotter, whatever, and then the dungeon timer was made a little more relaxed, these would not have been voted so low. That's why I think BFA had like the worst like displayed relationship. So, oh yeah, I put that sentence here. This could suggest that there is a relationship between BFA dungeon timer and popularity, unless there are serious enough flaws, which are the ones I just listed in Toldagor and Siege of Borealis. In Shadowlands, I didn't really have much to say here because it says, in Shadowlands, the regression provides with a p-value of 0.0097, indicating that there's indeed a significant relationship. Surprisingly, Sanguine Depths scored 5th, because usually people are like, ugh, Sanguine Depths, right? But that one scored 5th in popularity, despite having the second longest dungeon timer. Regardless, the results from the methods were quite conclusive. So I just put like additional things here. Oh yeah, so this is why I explained the aggregated data is more important than looking at it individually, but looking at it individually will still give you important information. It's valuable to compare all the expansions across to create a larger data set, allowing us to draw more comprehensive conclusions. Doing this also minimized the impact that a few dungeons had, such as Toldagor and Archway, that deviate furthest from the trend line, giving us more confidence in the direction of the effect. The concern with this approach is ensuring that the data comparable between the 3 expansions, which is why we normalize the votes to account for fewer people voting for Legion and BFA than they did in Shadowlands Dungeons. Although the comparison between the expansions is still imperfect, we believe this is a sufficiently robust metric to facilitate cross-expansion. We still believe this is a sufficiently robust metric to facilitate cross-expansion comparison. So then I re-elaborate that when you total, or with the total ones, the p-value is 0.0035, which is the most significant result we got. And then also, in other words, putting it, saying that there's a 99.65% chance that this relationship is due to the factors I'm testing for, not by chance. And then I just wanted to be clear here, and I'm saying, however, I want to be clear, I am not inferring that subtracting 1 minute of Mists would increase a dungeon's popularity. Because Mists has a time of... where is it? Mists... oh my god, where is it? Oh, 30 minutes. It is the shortest one, with Celia's Gambit is also 30 minutes. But that was added later. So, Mist is one of the shortest dungeons in Shadowlands, right? Now, if you made it 29 minutes, I just want to be clear, I am not saying that would make it more popular. Because a lot of this... Blizzard designed these dungeons, obviously, keeping in mind the difficulty and how long that they may take to complete. And they try their best to balance that. So I'm just making it clear that subtracting a minute would not make it more popular. Now, contrary to what we're looking at, adding a minute would probably actually make it more popular, but you get the point. This is kind of taking into consideration the Blizzard balance. So, to summarize, our methodology for the study seems to indicate that there is a provable relationship between dungeon timer and survey ranking. Acknowledging that responses sometimes yield imperfect results, it does appear that if all players' preferences and skill level were accurately recorded, it would result in the same conclusion that there is a significant relationship between the variables. In our survey, with the question number 5, I said, we included an any additional thoughts question where players often chose to justify the reasoning behind their favorite dungeons. In the optional responses, the length of the dungeon was almost never actually mentioned, in favor of other factors such as dungeon linearity, AoE friendliness, boss design, unfair mechanics, and camera control freedom, and by that I mean visibility. Despite players rarely emphasizing dungeon timer as a factor for their favorite dungeons, there is conclusive quantitative evidence of a link between timer and preference. So the reason I'm saying this is because the point of this sentence is to show people, you'll ask them, why don't you like that dungeon? And they'll say, oh, because this boss sucks, or oh, this one's unfair, or oh, I don't like this or that. But funny enough, very little of them are mentioning timer when that seems to be one of the biggest factors in determining why someone actually likes a dungeon. And again, when I say biggest, I'm not saying there is not 100% chance that that's not 100% of the explanation why somebody prefers a dungeon, right? If we just go back, that's what the R squared says. If this was solely due to timer, we would see a R squared result of 100. But by it being 27.43%, that basically means that 27.43% of the reason somebody chooses their favorite dungeon is going to be based on the length of the dungeon, like the timer. So this is the one that got published to... Oh yeah, this is the thing that got published